moment. So as I said, this is a co-production of the ESI. First of all, the ESI, which has been a player in this whole area of people-nature interactions for a long time now, and is celebrating its 10th anniversary. And this is one of the events as part of that celebration. There's a whole set of things going on around the 10 years. Hopefully, I'm told, culminating in a big party. If you want to know more about 10 years, then Jane Wills, who's the director of these is sitting just here. So if you want to know more, please do ask. The second player in this is the Biodiversity and People Network, which some of you will have heard of, which is one of these university research networks where we're trying to join up people who are interested in this broad topic of the interactions between people and nature, people and biodiversity. This is a co-thing between the Renew project and the university network system. If you are interested, if you are working in this area at all, even just tangentially, please do get in touch with us and join the network. We don't place huge demands on you. It's largely about connecting people and improving information flows. The Renew project is this big NERC project, which began just over a year ago, which is really focusing on how we interrogate the relationships between people and nature to better improve the status of nature in the UK. The UK has one of the most depleted biodiversities on the planet, and we really need to regrow our natural assets. That poses lots of challenges in terms of interacting with communities, government, land managers, businesses, etc. And that's really what this project is about. And you're going to hear some of what you'll hear today actually flows out of this project. One of the things that we're doing within the Renew project is actually a bit of self-reflection around how does collaboration, particularly interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary interactions work best, and learning from that. And there are going to be some notes and things taken from today. Where's Eleanor? Eleanor's somewhere in the back. If that's all under Chatham House rules, if there are things that you want, if you're going to say things that you want off the record, please just shout and Eleanor will ignore the fact that you're saying those. So there's nothing particularly being attributed to individuals here. Is that right, Eleanor? Yeah. That's right.
If anyone wants more information
Thank you very much. So on to personalised ecology. So each of us, all of you, have what I call a personalised ecology. You have a unique set of interactions with the natural world, particularly through, and here we're particularly often thinking about direct sensory interactions, but it could be broader than that. And those ebb and flow through your day, through your week, through your year, through your lifespan. And we're really interested in the role, I'm really interested in the role that those play in attitudes, approaches. I'll touch on why I think some of this is important briefly now. It's interesting to reflect upon kind of, it's a wild day out here, but what your nature experiences have been today. They'll probably be different at the weekend. They'll be different if you're having a holiday next week or the week after. You can characterize those personal ecologies in lots of different ways. They're very complex. They have lots of components. Some interactions are more immediate than others. Some of them you're actually, up front with some vegetation or a bird or whatever. Sometimes you're sitting gazing out of windows, as we are here. Some of them are more conscious. Some of them are less conscious. Some are very aware of the nature around us. Some of us less so. Sometimes we're aware. Sometimes we're less aware. Some of that's more intentional, very purposeful. Some of it's actually incidental. It happens to us rather than that we were seeking those interactions. Some of it's strongly mediated. Some of it we're pulling nature to us. We're feeding the birds. Some of it's less mediated. Can have lots of directional outcomes. Some of those will be positive for us. Some of those will be negative for us. And equally, it can have different outcomes for nature itself, some of which can be very positive and some of which can be very negative. And so imagine for each of us, that's a very complex array of kinds and really difficult to unpick and understand what's going on. This is particularly important at the present time because many people across the globe are undergoing an extinction experience. So their interactions with nature are a good deal less than they might have been in their previous lives, or previous life, earlier life, suggesting your life, and also then previous generations. We've just published earlier this year a big a sort of systematic review this area, asking what's the evidence, and it varies depending upon what kinds of connections with nature you're thinking about, whether those are physical ones or psychological ones, whether it's in your childhood or lifelong, where you are in the world and what your income levels. But there is very, very many case studies now showing that there is an extinction experience going on. So the value of those interactions, what those interactions do to us, starts to matter a lot if those things are shifting. This is a sort of conceptual framework, length and won't, about personalised ecology in terms of how it's shaped and what its consequences might be. So there are a number of drivers of personalised ecology, and we can broadly think about those in terms of our motivations to interact with nature, our opportunities to do so, and our capabilities to do so. That opportunity is being shifted a lot by what's happening to biodiversity itself. There are lots of other things which shape the opportunity, how many green spaces there are, whether you can get out into nature, etc. But it's being profoundly shaped. So this graph is actually what's happened to the numbers of individual birds in Europe over about a 20-25 year period. Actually, the declines in Britain have been even sharper. Bird numbers have gone down by about 20%. In Britain now, there are about 2.5 breeding birds for each of you. You think about lots of wildlife out there, but actually there isn't a lot of wildlife. So, I mean, how many birds have you seen? Well, today they're all hiding. I don't know. They're all deep in the bushes. But you know, you think about how many birds you might see in a typical day, for example, but how many other people are seeing those same things? If you destroy the hedgerow in your garden, it probably wiped out your 2.5 birds. It really is a very small number. And it's in decline and continues to be in decline. Think about motivations, and those are shifting a lot. I don't know how true this headline actually was, but lots of issues around, particularly around young people, and less motivation to get out there. I think the notion that we were all, those of us who are older, were always kicked outdoors and spent our entire summers living in the countryside is actually a bit of a myth. But clearly there are, I think the average figures for children on screen time for children now across Europe is something like 7 hours a day. So there clearly are big shifts going on. And then there are issues of capability. This is actually how people's hearing changes in different age groups. And actually, there are birds that you can't hear as you get older, for example. You lose the top frequencies. So there's capability issues that shift with our lives, as well as with our opportunities and our motivation. Lots of this stuff really isn't that well understood. I mean, much of what I'm talking about here, there aren't tons of literature exploring those interactions. We know an awful lot about people's physical capabilities and sensory capabilities, but how that interplays with our personalised ecologies, we actually know very little about. As well as drivers, there are also what are the consequences of personalised ecologies. There are clearly benefits for people. There are costs for people, particularly from negative interactions. There's benefits for nature and there's costs for nature. There's lots of things we could unpack in here. But a couple of sort of really headline ones that there's lots and lots of work being done, particularly through ECHH. I think Lewis will talk about some of this later, about the benefits of interacting with nature for health and well-being. And this is some work that Daniel Cox, sitting here, did with us, trying to pull out the effects of your frequency of your nature interactions, how long those interactions are, and the intensity of your nature experiences, if you like, and the consequences they might have for measures of health and well-being. That's one of tons of studies, and lots of people at ECHH have done systematic reviews and shown there are some really important general signals in here where interacting with nature actually matters for your health and well-being. There's also growing evidence that it matters for your behaviours and your attitudes towards biodiversity itself. There are growing numbers of studies around that. This is one that we just published again earlier this year. This is data from Japan. On the x-axis here is the frequency of people's recent nature experiences, and on the y-axis a measure of the expression of particular behaviours, pro-biodiversity behaviours. And this is a whole array of different behaviours here. All you need to see is that most of these are positive. So actually, the greater your nature interactions, the more likely you are to be exhibiting pro-biodiversity behaviours. And there's a potential link in there between those experiences and how we regard nature and our attitudes just to it. There are also lots of feedback loops in here. And again, we could unpack this at great length. One I just want to talk about very quickly is something that, again, we've just done this year, talking about what we call the vicious cycle of biophobia. So the notion that there are feedbacks here. If you have growing disconnection from nature, you might fear nature a bit more, avoid nature a bit more. You're actually not so supportive about there being more nature out there, and around we go again with greater disconnection, so forth. And there's a lot of evidence for each of the. There is evidence for each of these different kinds of steps. But there is a cycle in here, and there are probably lots of these kinds of feedback loops here, which make this all a really complex set of things to unpack and disentangle. By way of introduction, I just wanted to kind of leave you with a message of I worry a lot that actually understanding these issues and a lot of the patterns in here are really just critical for the future of biodiversity. Unless we understand these things and understand how they interplay with biodiversity loss, with protection that we put on biodiversity for its renewal, we're really not going to solve these problems. Of course, there are other forces at play. They're important to recognise, but actually, this personalised stuff matters, I think, a lot, and yet it hasn't played out in much of the discussion around how we protect biodiversity. How we know how technically to do a lot of the things to save the future of biodiversity. We know how to create protected areas. In fact, we know how to go out there and build a new wetland or a new woodland. It's the people bit and these interactions that we need to know a lot more about. And really much of that is at the heart of the Renew project, trying to do, and why. So the Renew project is about biodiversity renewal, but it's actually principally about the interplay between and nature. That's all I had to say by way of quick introduction. What we've got today is 4 speakers who are going to talk about very, very different aspects. Personalised ecology and relations between people and nature. But before we get into that, one thread of the Renew project is something called X cases, which provides lots of opportunities for other people to get involved. And the X cases team are going to come and talk to you quickly about that. Okay, folks? Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kevin, for giving us a few minutes. We just wanted to, well, the slides are coming up. We just wanted to take this opportunity to say hello especially me because I'm new. We are a complete postdoc team now of 3. This is us on the screen, and we work with Matt and Sarah. And our education team is something that sort of works across the whole of the Renew setup. So our aim is to be, well, we have transdisciplinary backgrounds. We aim to be conveners and facilitators. We try to amplify like lived experience as well as more recognised, formalised expertise. And we want to create space for complexity and thinking through things together to try and find new ways forward on tricky subjects. So yeah, the whole point, can we?
Oh, right.
Sorry. So we kind of see ourselves as sort of circling the whole of Renew, sort of stopping off in different themes and overlapping what everyone else is doing. And our team aims to be dynamic and energized, and we hope that you can like come and see us as like a friendly team you can call upon and talk to early in your research ideas. And if you have things going on that you're not sure what to do with, maybe we can step in and help. So on that, Michelle's going to talk about missions.
So yeah, so how are we going to do this? We're going to that. So what are missions is a question that everyone always asks us. So I won't spend too long on this because you can find us. We have presence on the website. You're welcome to pick up the phone or send us an email, but essentially something consistent with the aims of Renew, obviously. The people-centric part is really important, I think. That's something that we sometimes need to also remind some of the partners. Realistically achievable in a 3-month timeframe, that is really critical. I think that is going to be a really limiting factor. So I think we're kind of thinking concentrated bursts of activity, bringing diverse people together. I think also for the transdisciplinary element, we're trying to look beyond academia. We're trying to really stretch our tendrils out to try and draw people in and try and really create some new ideas and new energy and new kind of legacy pathways for participatory processes. So specific opportunities, they need to be specific, I think is the point there. And using information in new and different ways, joined up thinking, innovation, I think those are really key words. And I think impact, we want to make a difference. I think we really want to make a difference. And because they're quite short, quite punchy, sort of collaborative efforts, I think we have the chance to feed into policy processes. We have the chance to feed back into some of the work the themes might be doing that might link the themes together, that might link us with other organisations. So I think, yeah, I'm hoping to see this as a really kind of dynamic thing, and also just sort of, I think process is also important. So we're looking at solutions, but we're sort of part of the bigger solutions. I think, don't feel that there needs to be concrete outcomes. It can be starting off a kind of energy and collaboration.
Right.
Over to Dave.
Thanks, Michelle. So we go. Yeah, just to give you a flavour of the kind of stuff we've been doing. We've been having a lot of conversations early on, getting to know a lot of the Renew, our partners, and sort of digging into, you know, just where some of the gritty problems are around biodiversity renewal, that human dimension element. And so just to give you a flavour of the stuff that we've been looking at, and I'm thinking, you know, we might have a rolling series of missions coming in around things like some of the social aspects of deer management and the conflicts around deer and getting venison into the food chain. A lot of stuff around transitions in agriculture, you know, moving to more sustainable, nature-friendly, regenerative systems, and some of the proximate questions associated with that. People in nature, you know, looking at questions around rights of nature, social justice and environmental justice, trying to marry the two in different contexts and questions within there. And we're getting a lot of stuff in around woodland, you know, some of the complexities around woodland creation and the equitability of creating woodland and who has access, who manages that, who's able to use that resource. And so we've got quite a lot of broad topics at the moment, which we're now, the job is to drill into and pick up kind of gritty, proximate questions and turn them into mission format. So that's the kind of stuff we're doing. So if you've got ideas, get in touch, feed them into us, and we can sort of start that collaborative process of sort of shaping things up and maybe seeing what we can do in terms of to help deliver some of the stuff which Renew wants to deliver more broadly. So that's us. And so
Just not forgot to mention the form. You can go back a slide.
I can go back a slide.
I forgot to mention that you can submit in a very simple, direct way, just to start a conversation. It doesn't have to be it's not really the start of a formal process. It's just, here's an idea, let's have a conversation. The QR code's there. You can find us on the website, but if you go to the Exeter page, there's a link to that form, or you can just contact us via email, whatever works. But that kind of has a few of the questions we're looking for you to answer in order to start conversations.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Just to give, so you're looking for ideas. Can you just give people a kind of sense of a scope of how, it's an impossible question, of course, how big an idea or how small an idea you want to, what,
I think part of our job is to facilitate. So, you know, the idea could be quite big, could be quite a big problem. And the idea would be then that you get in touch, and as a team, we would facilitate a process of exploring where the mission might be within that larger question. Or it could be then something quite proximate, which is, you know, quite short term, quite time banded, which is already quite well shaped to be a mission. And you get in contact. But the idea is if you just err on the side of communication and getting stuff in, and then we'll go through a process of facilitating sort of co-production of that into the mission.
any questions about that?
We'll be around all today.
Yeah, please do grab these guys if you have any thoughts of something fit with what they're.
Very
Okay. Yes, Sarah.
Are you interested in ideas from beyond the Renew team?
Yeah.
Yes. Would you like us to publicise the opportunity widely across the university?
Yeah, so we've been making an effort to try and get the core missions out beyond you, and also with the 33 partners, but also beyond. So if you push it out, please do.
Okay.
Obviously, we work with different partners, the 33, and within the news. We're also open to novel collaborations and where there's experience or expertise. Very relevant.
David, Gail Whiteman in the chat says she'd like to talk to you about how we can explore and or test how personalised ecologies affect business decisions at the individual and organization. Yeah.
Okay, fine. So our next speaker is Katrina McKinnon, Professor McKinnon. Katrina, who's going to be talking about ethical perspectives on extinction experience. Katrina,
Thanks, Kevin.
thank you for braving the winds.
I know, I made it. Unbelievable. It's really hairy at the bottom more this morning. That was my nature experience. This is that is the clip now. Okay. Yeah. Hopefully that will work. Yes. Can you give me a wave when I've only got 5 minutes left? Yes. I do go on a bit. Okay. It's great to be here. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk, as Kevin said today, about the extinction of experience. So I was really pleased about a number of the things that Kevin was saying in his little intro, because it makes my life a lot easier when I actually get to the point of talking about ethical perspectives on the extinction of experience. But I want to situate what I'm going to say in a bigger project that I'm engaged in. I think it's important to see where the ethical concerns that I'm going to talk about are coming from. So what I'm going to talk about today is part of a much bigger project, which is leading to a co-authored monograph between myself and a political and environmental philosopher from the University of Washington, Steve Gardner. And we are exploring what we call blinding future generations, or intergenerational blinding. Before I tell you about that, this is a quick slide. I'm not going to read it all out, just to explain what I do. We're all sort of coming from very different places here at this event. So I am a normative political philosopher. What does that mean? That means that I'm interested in the way the world ought to be, primarily, not the way the world is. Of course, you can't engage with the question of how the way the world ought to be, questions of how the world ought to be, without thinking a little bit about how the world is. So I do, in fact, care about those questions as well. And I'm interested really primarily in structures, institutions, processes and norms. So political, social, cultural, economic dimensions of justice, rather than thinking about what individual people ought or ought not to do in the course of their lives. So the view that we're arguing for in this joint work is that as a background for you, we both agree, and both of us have done a lot of work in this area already, we both agree on the view that intergenerational injustice is a basic, standing and permanent threat in human societies and across them. Why is that? Well, that's because injustice is very often a product of unequal vulnerability. So when different parties are situated in ways such that there are power differentials between them, that creates the possibility for the abuse of that power, and it creates different patterns of vulnerability. So we think that there is no group of human beings more vulnerable to us in the present than those in the future. And by that we mean not just those with whom we overlap in terms of our own existence, but into the far future as well. They are entirely vulnerable to what we choose to do now. They can't alter what we choose to do now, and they can't hold us to account for what we choose to do now either. So this isn't a new thought, but that's our starting point, that we need to take intergenerational injustice as seriously as we take intragenerational injustice, that is injustice between people existing in the same temporal cohort. We think that despite the fact that there has been a big uptick in interest in the last 15 years from philosophers looking at intergenerational justice, we think for a long time we were very wary about saying this in public, because nobody likes to say we've really uncovered something we think is new, but we do think it's new. So we think that inquiry in this area has overlooked a really important domain or dimension of intergenerational injustice, which relates to generational knowledge and the transmission of generational knowledge. This has not been picked up in the philosophical, ethically oriented literature on intergenerational justice, and it's a big gap, we think, and there are reasons to take this very seriously. The name we use for this domain is intergenerational blinding, and the bigger picture of our work, those of you who know about epistemic injustice debates, we're trying to argue that intergenerational blinding is a form of epistemic injustice. I'm not going to talk about that today. That's just too much to say there. So what is intergenerational blinding? On our view, intergenerational blinding involves the ethically objectionable imposition of ignorance on one generation by another, the ethically objectionable imposition of ignorance on one generation by another. We think there are very clear examples of this already in the world. So one example we use in a work in progress relates to the way in which history textbooks have been sometimes rewritten to erase the sins of the past and protect the reputation of those who are having those history textbooks erased. So there are some very well-known examples from Japan with respect to the system of sexual slavery that the Japanese military ran in World War II. However, we think that this, our primary interest is in intergenerational blinding insofar as it is found, or at least there is potential for it to happen in the environmental domain. And really there has not been any work by political philosophers which has picked this up and tried to kind of unpack the type of injustice that's involved, the type of conduct that might bring it about, and what might be wrongful about intergenerational blinding. So as I've said, the abuse of the future in intergenerational blinding is made possible because generations have significant power to conceal from other generations or otherwise obscure what's happening to them. And the potential for that obscuring in the intergenerational realm, we think, is already clear in empirical work in ecology. So I am interested in the world as it is, which reveals a phenomenon called shifting baseline syndrome, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. So for Steve and I, we say, look, this could be a really important smoking gun for intergenerational blinding, and we ought to take this very seriously as a kind of entry point for ethical thinking about this new domain of intergenerational injustice. I'm not going to, my focus is really on the extinction of experience, which Kevin and I've forgotten your co-author's first name, Masa Soga, have identified as a mechanism which generates or can generate shifting baseline syndrome. But I'm sure most of you know, what is shifting baseline syndrome? Well, this is a well-documented phenomenon whereby over time, the baselines that any generation uses, or subset within a generation uses to judge the quality of the environment in which it finds itself, change or the content of those standards reflects the actual circumstances in which they find themselves. which includes any possible comparison with states of affairs in the past, which were worse or even better. So it's a kind of shifting baseline syndrome, shifting baselines as they shift iteratively over time across generations down the timeline, can put generations subject to them in a situation where they just fail to notice environmental losses or environmental gains. So we should be really, really worried about this. Scientists have done lots of work, well, some work at least, in mapping this out and trying to understand it. Environmental philosophers, political philosophers, ethical philosophers have done very little actually to engage with this, which I think is surprising and a bit weird. So as I said, so Kevin identifies, and his co-author identify the extinction of experience as one of the drivers of shifting baseline syndrome, along with some other things. And they define this as the progressive loss of human nature interactions. And as Kevin was saying at the beginning, there's lots of evidence, there's lots of reason to believe that this is really happening, and it's happening really in quite radical ways in some places, and it might even be speeding up, right? So this is something which is happening in the world, and it's contributing to shifting baseline syndrome, kind of repeating iteratively down the generations. So what? Ethically speaking, from the ethical point of view, if we care about how the world ought to be, if we care about relations between generations, why should we care about this, the extinction of experience and shifting baseline syndrome? I think one set of worries, which Kevin alluded to as well, which is I think is accurate and is a serious source of worry, are instrumental reasons for worrying about shifting baselines and extinction of experience. And the thought here is that what's wrong with the generational ignorance that is a product of the extinction of experience, whether it's a product of blinding or it's a product of some other set of processes, is likely to impede efforts to address environmental damage. And it can do that in two ways. So instrumentally, it stands as the generational ignorance that the extinction of experience is tantamount to, stands as a barrier to sustained efforts to either improve environmental circumstances or protect fragile gains. And it can do that in at least two ways. So Steve and I in the paper talk about a generation which has forgotten the good times. So this would be a generation who doesn't realize as a result of the extinction of experience that actually their environmental circumstances are really degraded compared to those of their ancestors. And as a result, they are in danger of being deluded about the degree to which their environment is deteriorating and has deteriorated, which will impede their efforts to actually take action to stem that damage. So that's one way in which ignorance can instrumentally be a barrier to environmental protection. However, I think it's also important to note the second way in which knowing how your current environmental state compares to those of the past is important. So we call this forgetting the bad times. So this is when a generation, as a result of having lost knowledge, fails to realize that actually things in the past were far worse, and they've actually managed to improve things, or over time, the quality of their environment has improved. But they just fail to see this because they're in the state of generational ignorance. That can lead them to be in a state of complacency about what they've actually got and the gains they've actually won. And those environmental gains are likely to be very fragile, right? They're very often fragile. And if we don't realize that they're gains, then, you know, the gains become very exposed and very at risk. And there's a danger that we could kind of go backwards. So I think this is the way we frame, I think, some of what Kevin was talking about in terms of pro-biodiversity behaviours. And I think that's pretty uncontroversial, actually. I think those are pretty straightforward reasons to be worried from an ethical point of view about the extinction of experience. However, we think, and this is where we start to push the envelope a bit, that there are also non-instrumental reasons for worrying about the extinction of experience. And I just want to focus on this for the remainder of my time. So non-instrumentally, generations who've lost knowledge as a result of blinding or some other process are damaged with respect to their capacities to know the world and their situation in it. So we think, I submit to you, that people in conditions of imposed forgetting, yet lacking insight into this, are often shadows of what they could be or once were. We worry about people in that kind of state of ignorance. And we use the example of the film WALL-E, which of course we've all seen, right? So in the film WALL-E, the human population survives only on a massive spaceship, and on the ship, people trundle around in their little craft, and they have the screens right in front of their faces in an entirely artificial environment controlled by the ship, which is a sort of version of HAL. They've got no memory of a green Earth, and they've got no memory of the forms of social life made possible on it as a result of the bad behaviour of earlier generations of Earthlings. So they have been blinded, this generation of WALL-E. In the end, spoiler alert, and with the help of WALL-E, they return and they start to grow plants, etc., and make good. But here's the kicker point for us in this example. We think that even if, in the story of WALL-E, these Earthlings were beyond any possible return to Earth, so the ending of the film is different, right? So that their instrumental reasons for thinking of, so our instrumental reasons for thinking of their forgetting as bad had no purchase, right? Because they can't do any work in generating pro-diversity behaviours on Earth because they never get to that point. We'd still think of those people as diminished. There would be a residue, right? We would have a remaining judgment, we say, of there being something wrong about the state of ignorance that those people are in. And it can't, in this example, have anything to do with instrumental worries. So this is the sort of space that we're interested in. So we signal, and I'm going to give you a thought experiment in a minute to try and persuade you that you agree with us. So we signal this point by saying that intergenerational blinding or lack of knowledge damages people's status as knowers of the worlds they inhabit and their place within them. And in doing that, we call the kind of injustice we say that is imposed on them is socio-locational injustice, which is a piece of our own terminology. So here's the thought experiment. So that's our view, is that there are instrumental reasons to worry about the extinction of experience. There are important non-instrumental reasons to worry about the extinction of experience as well. And in particular, those non-instrumental reasons to worry about that have not been properly noticed, actually, by environmental philosophers. And they have all sorts of ramifications for the way in which we think about generational justice broadly, whether it relates to the environment or not. So to kind of get you thinking that agreeing with us on this question of non-instrumental reasons, I'm going to ask you to engage in a very famous thought experiment by the philosopher Robert Nozick. So this thought experiment, Steve and I say, gives us a really extreme example of socio-locational injustice. So Nozick asks us, this is his description of the experience machine thought experiment. So he says, suppose there was an experience machine that would give you any experience you desired, and super duper neuropsychologists could stimulate your brain so that you would think and feel that you were writing a great novel, or making a friend, or reading an interesting book, or plug in anything you want there that would make your life a good life in your view. All the time, however, you're floating in a tank with electrodes attached to your brain. Should you plug into this machine for life, pre-programming your life's experiences? So there's lots of questions here about the experience machine and whether indeed we ought to plug in. Nozick's view is this. So his response to his own thought experiment is, and this is part of this does work for us. So he says plugging into an experience machine, part of what's wrong with it, limits us to a man-made reality, to a world no deeper or more important than that which people can construct. Perhaps what we desire is to live, an active verb, ourselves in contact with reality. Okay, and what we think the way in which we understand the non-instrumental reasons for worrying about the extinction of experience is that people who are in that kind of state have lost contact, don't know the true reality of their circumstances, because of the ignorant state that they're in with respect to how well their world fares in comparison with previous environmental states. So it's hard, of course, to dispute that if one person plugs in another person to the machine without their knowledge or consent, then a grievous wrong is done to the person who ends up in the tank, right? We think that's pretty obvious, and we think everybody would agree with that. So that's the kind of scenario that we're interested. We're not interested in this question is whether we should anyone plug into the machine. Maybe some people should plug into the machine. Maybe there are good reasons to do this. There's a big philosophical literature on this, actually, about whether you ought to plug into the machine or not. We don't really care about that question, right? What we're interested in is what's wrong with actually being in the machine. In that state of affairs, if somebody, in particular, if somebody has plugged somebody into the machine without their consent or knowledge, what kind of wrong has been done to that person? Putting consent aside, is there anything left with respect to the wrongfulness of the way in which that person has been treated? And we say that the nature of the state, the being plugged into the machine into which the victim is put, helps to illuminate socio-locational injustice. So one thing that the victim is deprived of, inter alia, are conditions in which the living of their life connects with the true reality of their situation. The experiences manufactured for them by the machine don't reflect and are not responsive, living in the active sense, to that reality. Indeed, in this extreme example, the non-consenting victim is forcibly situated in conditions that are totally severed from reality. Of course, this is an extreme example of socio-locational injustice. However, it delivers insights into intergenerational blinding, we say, as a form of socio-locational injustice. So we think that when one generation causes, sustains, or encourages blindness in later generations, their conduct is objectionable, at least in part, because of how it disconnects those later generations from the true reality of their situation. And because avoiding disconnection is fundamentally important for the living of lives in the active sense described by Nozick, as well as being important for generating pro-biodiversity behaviours. Do I have any time left?
You do.
I do. Oh,
You've got 15 minutes.
I've got 15 minutes left.
Started a bit early.
Oh, okay. Oh, good. I should have spoken.
People might need it.
We have got questions, yeah, but
Yeah.
I'll speak a little. I'll just say one more thing then, because I think all of this is quite possibly a little bit abstract. So let me just try and sort of ground this a little bit. So let me give you an example of a generation in the future living in a severely degraded environment. So we can imagine a generation living in an environment and they don't know the history of their circumstances and the way in which environments were much less degraded in times past. So they engage with the world as they find it. They are connecting with the world, right, in that sense, in some sense, right? So they swim in the polluted rivers and they wear masks to protect themselves from the polluted air, and they don't visit glaciers because there aren't any glaciers, and they build protection for their houses against storm surges, etc., etc. You might object to what I've been saying. Look, here we've got an example of a generation. They're engaging with the world as they find it. It's a trashed environment, but it's not as if they're sort of living in a bubble as the person in Nozick's experience machine is doing. They are actually engaging with the trashed environment that they live in. So, you know, in what sense does the non-instrumental account in what sense do the non-instrumental worries about blinding apply to this example? So what we say to this is that the relevant knowledge in this example that a blinded generation is deprived of is not first knowledge of a counterfactual, right? So it's not the case, we say, that what's lacking in this example is that the people in that generation don't know how the world could have been, right? That's not the knowledge that a generation gets deprived of when they've been blinded, because who knows how the world could have been? None of us have access to those kinds of counterfactuals. That's a much too demanding account. Okay? What we say about this particular example, the trashed environment example, is we just say, look, it's really unpersuasive to claim that the people in this example really do know the true reality of their world, unless they know how the degradation came about. So imagine that, in fact, these people are living in the aftermath of a global nuclear Armageddon, right? So they're living in a nuclear holocaust, or they're living in the aftermath of an abruptly interrupted geoengineering, solar geoengineering deployment, which causes a termination shock and temperatures skyrocket, etc., etc. We claim that if the people in the trashed environment, which is trashed because of these reasons, don't know this, then they are ignorant of the true reality of their situation, right? They don't know, despite the fact that they are connecting with the polluted rivers and breathing the polluted air, etc., they are, in some sense, diminished, right? They don't know their status in the world. They don't know the history of the environment that they are interacting with. And so they don't know the true reality of their situation. They know something. We're not saying they don't know anything about their situation, but there's an important ethical worry, which we think is usefully unpacked by Nozick's experience machine example, and doesn't map on to the instrumental worries we should have about the extinction of experience and how it impedes pro-biodiversity behaviour. And then we go on to do a lot more, but I'll stop there. Yeah, thanks.
Stop.
Charlie.
Thank you very much, Katrina, for this. Really enjoyed this. I'm wondering whether you and have been looking at the factors, social factors about one cause of this balance, this intergenerational one.
Yeah.
Tell us about have been.
So empirically we haven't, but we have examples. So I think Kevin talked about the kind of the control, increasing amount of control over children's outdoor experiences, and how that seems to empirically be sort of be real, right? I mean, this is, and it doesn't seem to be limited just to particular sort of regions in the world. There seems to be something happening more or less globally with respect to contraction of children's experiences with nature and biodiversity. And we think that's a potential locus for intergenerational blinding, right? So we think that if we have, and I'm using we very broadly here, created, sustained and enabled all sorts of political, economic, cultural institutions and processes which are having this effect on children, then we as a generation are culpable for that, right? That is a form of generational blinding. We didn't mean to do it. That's not the relevant test, right? But if we know that the effects, as we do, are potentially really damaging, then in permitting this to sort of go on and even accelerate, we're acting recklessly, right? And recklessness is a way in which reckless conduct is the kind of conduct that can generate injustice. So our claim here isn't about, anybody's meaning to sort of, I think the examples of like the Japanese textbooks where there's a deliberate intention to scrub out history, those are extreme and uncommon examples. I think the real world examples are going to relate to, the way in which, schools are run, right, and funded, and what sorts of activities children get supported to do in schools and how these become more and more limited. Or norms of parenting, right, whereby if you let your children kind of run wild in the woods, you're then a bad parent. And of course, there's all sorts of sexist norms and expectations about that. So we do think that there are places to go looking for this in the world, and we're trying to engage with empirical literatures to sort of, rather than just make, I love thought experiments, philosophers' thought experiments, but this is something where you've actually got to go and try and start to point to places in the world where this might be, these structures might be existing and replicating.
Ilya.
Oh, sorry, can you, once you get the question, can you repeat it with people online?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
We haven't got a microphone for the.
I'll try, yeah.
So the answer to this may well be is different kettle of fish entirely, but I guess to a large extent, it will be issues as much as previously. guess easily won't go with that. Doesn't need to go that far back in time. Say that each generation has more of it. How does that play out? I'm just sort of thinking things like the current government net zero policy, which is reliant on technologies that exist yet. So,
No, I think that's really, so I think what Ilya was asking or was raising is the fact that it looks like there are certain sorts of knowledge that accumulate over time and over generations. So we know more about the migration patterns of swallows now than previous generations did. And then I guess the question is, how does that actually map onto what we're saying about the potential for blinding, which I think is a really good point. I think one thing to say, which I didn't mention, I skipped over in the slides, is that there is work by a psychologist at the same university as Steve, actually, Peter Kahn, and he he's done a number of studies which show that intergenerational forgetting is consistent with an increase in kind of factual knowledge, right? So over time. So he did a study of inner city African-American children in Houston in this highly polluted environment. And they were very knowledgeable about the facts of what pollution is, what processes lead to it, et cetera, and yet they didn't believe that they lived in a particularly polluted environment, right? And he then sort of does additional work to kind of describe this in terms of what he calls generational amnesia. So I think what you're saying there about how actually we have increases in scientific knowledge, that's entirely consistent with the processes that we're interested in. That's one thing. A second thing is that, again, I skipped over this, but when we talk about knowledge and intergenerational knowledge, we mean that to be a really broad category. So not just sort of propositional knowledge, not just knowledge of fact, but sort of know-how as well as knowing that, appreciation of the salience of particular pieces of information, a kind of we're struggling at the moment in this work to sort of find a way to describe this, but almost a sort of experiential knowledge. I don't know whether phenomenological is the right word, but we don't limit it just to, the idea here isn't that blinding happens when one generation deprives a future generation of knowledge of facts. That might be the case. The textbook example is a good example of that, but we think it's much broader than that. And even when factual blinding doesn't happen, there's all sorts of other types of knowledge and ways of knowing that can be undermined intergenerationally.
More question?
Questions in the chat?
Yeah, go for it.
I don't know if you want to have a look, just to summarise from this, but one is who gets to define which was told, generation finding.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So two questions about who decides what's relevant, what kind of knowledge is relevant for thinking about blinding. I think they were asking similar questions in different ways. I think that's really important, and we don't have an answer to that. I mean, that's what we're trying to do, is kind of here is sort of build up the structure for thinking about this new domain of intergenerational injustice. And then there are subsequent questions as to the content of, particular instances of blinding. So what would actually count as a blinding? Does this piece of knowledge count, or does generation being denied this kind of knowledge count? I think that's an open question. It's an interesting question, but there isn't a framework to talk about it in the literature at the moment at all. So we're sort of, we're opening up the debate for other people to come in and kind of chuck their views in. That's one thing. A second thing to say is that we don't think that all generational forgetting is unjust. There's all sorts of things that we don't know that previous, I don't know how previous generations danced at their weddings, or you know, or how they named their pets, or you know, maybe somebody knows that, and maybe that is a valuable thing to know. But I think that's well beyond the domain of ethical inquiry. You know, those sorts of instances of types of knowledge we don't think fall under the umbrella of what we're interested in. And there might be many. It might be that the processes of generational forgetting, a lot of them are quite natural, inevitable, and unavoidable, right? And that's perfectly fine, consistent with what we say here as well. If something's unavoidable, then, you know, the question of whether it's wrongful doesn't really arise. So I think those are good questions, and they are related to power, as somebody in the chat said. And I think that's, you know, it could be that we, you know, we're in a position as a current living generation of greatly unequal power with future generations. And we might be very tempted to excuse ourselves with respect to the things that we do that are likely to blind future generations. We might tell ourselves that we've got no other choice, or it's not really that important, or we're somehow compensating for the blinding that we're doing. And I think that's really important. We need to be on our guard with all of that. And then there was a question about animals, and bringing animals into yeah, I don't think that intersects with this particular project. So Steve and I have written separately on the importance of having a very critical attitude towards a really hard-nosed anthropocentrism, whereby the value of non-human nature is completely explained only by the fact that humans value it, right? We don't think that's an adequate way at all to think about ethics. I don't think it's related to this particular project, but maybe we could talk about blinding animals. I just haven't thought about that, maybe. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Next up is Dr. John Clark from English, who is talking about finding home in the tin slimes.
Well, I was going to do that.
All right. I was going to talk about that.
Get to the tin slimes. But I want to say this quite personal. I think we do a lot of very important cultural and psychological thinking through our personal ecologies. Sex, death, and being eaten are things that children are fascinated with. So I'm going to think a little bit about my childhood growing up in West Cornwall and try and trace a pathway from that through to the current research that I do. I'll read some poems and I will reflect on them and hopefully reflect a little bit on the importance of ecology and those encounters with human species, the kinds of disturbance that they can have on the minds of children and on adults. That is very helpful. Shows that there are different ways in which things can be done, different ways in which sex can be conducted, different ways in which things can be eaten. So, yeah, I grew up in school quite I think the cultural side of our engagement with ecology is really important. I grew up in West Cornwall. I was a pretty fervent Methodist, but I went to one of the chapels in St. Ives that considered itself a little bit more enlightened. It wasn't one of the Calvinist ones, which was where people would always come up to you and ask you, were you saved? Had you let Jesus into your heart? There was some of that in the background, but some of the men who in the men's group were quite into science. And we had one Sunday school teacher who was, I think, a lab technician, the old centre dairy. And one day he brought in a microscope for us to look at water that had been gathered from a pond just outside St. Ives. And in some ways, and I don't want to push this too much, but it was a sort of I was being given a sort of 19th century transcendental encounter. I was being told that I should read the natural world as the expression of God's love for us. That here were what an astonishing creator God there was around us that could create the things that we were going to look at through this microscope. Now, around this time, there were things going on in my own family. breakup taking place. So a lot of things were uncertain for me. And, like a lot of children around that time, I was going through those kinds of things. There were all kinds of spaces that opened up in my life. Started to be, and feelings that I couldn't articulate, that started to be answered, or that I was able to think through by looking really intensely at the ecosystems, the organisms that were around the house where I live. And of course, once you start looking really closely, things start to get a bit disturbing. So I'll begin with a poem about the microscope. Sunday school, with the uncle who tests the milk at the dairy, we look into creation through the big brass microscope. He's brought in for Pentecost in a black wooden case. It's tarnished like a trumpet, holds the boxed engravings of Wesley in the men's room. He says no artist, even Leonardo, made anything as beautiful as a bird's nest. I stand on a chair to gaze through its peephole at water, collected from the pond where we sail our boats on Good Friday. My eye, a blank disc of light, guillotined by a slide. It's spasming, stained glass, insurgents, all bite, fuck, and filament, devouring what heavenly light of Christ is left in my heart's wild, loud beating. The green jeweled watch unhinged, springs and escapements tumbling through cold light. I grasp at the microscope, and the jar falls from the table. A dark shout flung across the upper room's bare boards, while they all sang on in the faraway chapel. So, it was a moment of ontological crisis, you might say, of a 19th century kind. I had a very strong faith, but around that time, it all started to fall apart. And it was through these, I suppose, connected up with the idea of biophobia. I was quite phobic, and very concerned around contamination. And yeah, I had quite a lot of anxieties. And these started to be articulated by the environment around. Children do a profound amount of discovery and thinking through those. We've all looked at spiders and flies in webs and heard that kind of buzz. We've all turned over rocks and seen ants scurrying off with their eggs. We've all been shocked and disturbed by those profound recognitions that the world is far more different and far more complex than we thought it to be. And in a way, that's what poetry is always interested in. And I think that's what ecologists are always interested in. That's what biodiversity renewal is interested in, so that future generations can have similar encounters, similar senses of the limits of human knowledge, and also a sense of our own meatiness, our own mortality, our own part in the ecosystem as, meat in the system that will be eaten, that will reproduce itself, that is part of something in which we are deeply interconnected. Now, I grew up I lived on Portland Point, I don't know, sometimes Spain. So there's some very extraordinary little ex-daffodil meadows just above the rocks, which are full of yellow meadow ants, cockchafers. It's just, our house was absolutely, people talk about that blizzard of moths. It was, you could go out on a summer's evening and the light would just be a storm of moths around it, and the spiders' webs would be in shreds with so many things hanging off them. Well, one summer, when my father left for a while and my mum wouldn't leave the house, I would just go out and explore the environment around me. And I started to notice that there were hundreds and thousands of cabbage white butterflies everywhere. There's a lot of wild animals. And these absolutely fascinated me. I spent hours outside just watching them, finding them in old paintings, finding it in the kind of ruins of this unfinished house. So now I'm going to read a poem that's about that. I chuckled later. Well, I mean, this is the kind of thing that happens. You realize you have this kind of an encounter, and then you discover that other people have had similar feelings to you. Too. This is about the Ichneumon wasp. I didn't know what an Ichneumon wasp was when I was 10, but I'd seen all these extraordinary caterpillars around the house, and I'd been studying them. And of course, then later I discovered that Darwin also felt that, you know, one of the great questions that God had to answer was how he could possibly have made something that did such a thing to a caterpillar. So I realized that I was not alone in having this sense of body horror and shock at what I discovered. You'll see that I want to make, I think it's also deeply intertwined with our own personal stories, hence the reason why I'm sharing this biographical information, because ecology doesn't exist just out there, it's throughout our lives. It's one of the big things that we think things through. That's my contention. The bedroom blind, bright red, my father enters the room. Look after her. Then gently closes the door on his voice. After he's gone, my mother won't go out. Silence swells around us, twisting each tuft of the carpet with its long glass songs. In moments opening between breaths, within sea light and shadow, a soft plague of caterpillars presses into door jambs, under window ledges, rims of empty white paint tins, the sky embroidering our house with secret messages. I learn plump green and yellow bodies, bristles like first beard hair, jaws that make skeletons of cabbage on the headland. As I touch and stroke their life into mine, they bunch and knot, or lift and wave tails, as if magnetized by an invisible source. Through cracks in days, I gaze as they fawn into armor, genie slips, encased storms, hooked feet blowing into wings, but some cannot change. Fog swells and whispers in them until, come morning, yellow cocoons dangle from bodies burst like rotten hammocks. I was so shocked. I can still see those little yellow cocoons hanging from the split body of the cabbage white caterpillar. So death, sex, transformation, all of these things are absolutely part of our imaginative life, and they are articulated for us often early on in our childhood by our encounter with these other species with which we live our lives, which we might not pay a great deal of attention to. And one of the functions that poetry has is to try and bring those unspoken experiences, those situations in which the modern human has spoken something for us, they've articulated something for us, and to try and bring it into a communicable language of metaphor and image that we can share and discuss with each other. So, I grew up obviously in the pristine community where everything was lovely and clear, but I was deeply aware as a child of the tin mining industry and the plume of red mine tailings that flood out into St. Ives Bay, dewatering the mines or after heavy rain. And I absolutely loved it because it produced the most wonderful silts you could play in. If you went surfing, in waves. It was all very, very exotic and very interesting. So when I was thinking of a project that I wanted to do about rubbish and waste and rubbish feelings and the complex relationship we have with our ecology, I thought, well, let's go and look at a river that's not really been celebrated in the same way that some of our slightly marginally better, but literary rivers have been celebrated, like the Dark or the Torridge, and so on. And I discovered, but at the beginning of the project, you're kind of wondering, what is it that's really going to kick this off? What's going to really get me excited? And I was very fortunate to have some support from a volunteer group and a man called Steve Jones. And he said, well, you must really come and look at the last remaining dragonfly site on the banks of the Red River. It's just a scrubby bit of waste ground by the fire station at Tolbaden Junction. And you can't really see it from the road. And you look down as you can't really see it, but it's the last proper, you know, where there are scarce blue-tailed damselflies, keeled skimmers, emperors. I mean, it's a really extraordinary sight, and it's full of mine waste, sludge that is precipitated out due to the neutralization of acid drainage into these tanks, and it's covered everything with this extraordinary covering of fine particles of silt. And as soon as I went onto this site with Steve and sat looking into these long concrete tanks overgrown with gorse and heather, and looked into them, sort of scum, the biofilm on the surface, looked through the absolutely crystal clear water, I felt like I'd found something that was truthful and that spoke to me about the full impact that we were having on our planet and the way in which it was responding to us. Because I felt that I was having a kind of deep time experience of the world, how it might respond to us and re-evolve without us. Because here were toxic foods full of sludge that were being recovered. I was very fortunate to have Laura Newsom and Karen Hudson Edwards from the Camborne School of Mines come with me and point out that in these tanks, there were clumps, kind of cauliflower-like coral reef clumps of bacteria that were rising up through the water. So these places that seemed dead and toxic were full of horsetails, dragonflies, and bacteria. And it felt as if, as the clumps racing onto the beauty spots of West Cornwall, here I was in an extraordinary landscape that seemed to be looking back both to the beginning in time and forwards towards our current moments. It was a great place to think with. So ecological sites and hidden biodiversity and strange biodiversity are great places to go and think through what it is that we do, and to see ourselves in perspective. So I'm going to close my discussion about this about my own personal ecology with a short reading of a few poems about the sediments at Great Wheel Seaton, which are in the shadow of the acreage at Tolbaden Junction, and being maintained by volunteers who basically farm it for the biodiversity that is currently there. It's evolved over 300 or 400 years. And London becomes such a site of importance. This is called Great Wheel Seaton divinations. And divinations because I saw them as oracular sites. You know, Delphi, Camborne, the perfect ride. It was a place to receive messages from the ecosystem about our situation. And it's a kind of world turned upside down. It's a strange, weird, Anthropocene environment that I'm thinking about. And I'm also thinking about Andrew Marvell and his Up on Appleton House and various kinds of floodings at times of crisis. Anyway, that's my bother. What really matters is whether any of this comes through to you. So it's five or six short poems, and that will see me through to 10 to 12 heavy questions. So it begins with a couple of Delphic maxims. Go thy measure, certainty brings insanity. That should be a kind of scientist motto. Surely, I mean, it's a creative motto, but a grid of walls gauges the valley's disturbed contours. Obsession, returning to heather and gorse. Gaze through the windows of poison, the long slots of dead water. Let vision proliferate. The tanks are transparent animals, speechless at the horror of their naked organs. Frog spawn hangs in snow-covered branches of cedars, like giant bunches of grapes taken from the freezer and left to defrost on a counter. The eggs have the sadness of glue bags. A killing intoxication lives within. Each dulled globe contains a wrenching seed. Great events are occurring at the edges. A scum feather fleets where a twig touches the surface of a trickle. Islands of bacteria crinkle and rise through water clear as a glass-bottomed boat. Bone blue corals crumbling as a hand slips in to make certain it's all not a dream of the world beginning over without us. Each tank is an atmosphere of water depth, flow rate, pigment, a colour swatch of forgotten disasters. Here are green rain room, stone winter, silent record. The sun exhales. As if a balloon pilot shut off the gas burner, my shadow quietens and insists over a model village tailings dam failure, the orange curds trembling in the mill pond. I want to lie down and let the waters close over me, silt on my eyes like ash on a skylight. My breath held, my held breath, an old house gone still. Days pass through. I am clear about it. Rain rings above me in millions of moments of being. In the abandoned institution of the soul, old ducting, rippled interiors, spilt hymns, their caddis eyes wander their heaps of stiff. I'll finish it. A door opens in the surf, and the tide spills up the valley. Why doesn't this happen? I asked. It pours into adits and shafts, sluices over the walls of settling tanks as if they were tide pools, turns and is gone as if it had never been. But for a school of grey mullet, stirring soft blasts as they nuzzle sludge with all sensing lips. Patient, unpredictable, they glide and articulate the clouds. I wake and know I have been home. Okay, I shall leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. That last one was a kind of dream poem, because I started dreaming about a site. I don't know about you. I dream about biodiversity. It's you know, growing up in St. Ives Valley, I used to be told about the pilchard shoals and about the extraordinary fish that used to be around the end of the harbour. I never saw them, but I longed mackerel shoals to be in the bay. I did occasionally see them, but I still feel blessed when I have a dream where I look through water and I see fish swimming, mackerel swimming through it in some way, and the seas are still teeming. Anyway, any questions? Yeah, John.
So thank you very much for this. It's brought me back to some sort of time as well. But made me think of something related to what Katrina's talk, which is when I was a child, the experiences that I had with nature that a lot more interesting. And I don't know if it's because I've become
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but it feels like almost someone that just who's you know, for whom the joy's been sucked out of it. I don't know what it is. I don't want to paint a terrible picture of myself.
No, I do.
I've done that.
Yeah.
And I remember, you know, connecting with nature in much more intense ways. And when you spoke about your experiences, childhood experiences, that kind of could brought me back there, but I can't say I'm managing to get them still. Yeah. And I wonder whether this was something.
They both probably, Laureate, Louise Good, so rather depressingly, we see once in childhood, the rest is memory.
Oh, well, there you go.
I don't believe it. I can't accept that. I cannot accept it. But I think it is about. I mean, we all know it in a way. It does take time. It does take time, and the kind of outward, attentive concentration in order to see through all the accretions of our experience of having seen something in order to see it again. And that does take a lot of time and effort to do so. I find it difficult. I find my ice skating over things. But if you can create that space to recast your attention into something far beyond yourself, anxieties that you, then I still think it is possible to experience a sense of both positive and negative disturbance when encountering the natural world. And part of the work that I'm going to be doing for Renew is trying to harness that very, very intense early childhood experience of biodiversity that sustains us through the rest of our lives and keeps us fascinated by its weirdness, its strangeness, its shockingness. And I think we've got to help the next generation find a language to articulate their feelings about it and its strangeness. Yeah. Yes.
How early in life were you able to express all these feelings?
I don't think I was able to express it. I think I was quite a shy, silent, withdrawn child who spent a lot of time hiding in things. And it took me a long time to find the words in order to say what I was feeling. But I knew as soon as I started to think back, once I started to get some control over language, I realized that this was those pre-verbal, intense encounters were absolutely fundamental to who I was. And I needed to go back and think through what they were telling me, what they were continuing to tell me about who I was, you know, as a person who doesn't know themselves. I always loved the Lacanian idea that I'm afraid, you know, that could articulate the strangeness for me and make me feel more than the person that I usually feel that I am. Because I suppose that's what I'm always hungry for, is that sense that there is more for me than the me that gets bored. So the simple answer to your question is I didn't really have a language for it, but I had I think that emphasis that I had from Sunday school about the importance of reading the world around me, that might somehow release God into my heart, you know, that God was immanent in the world around me. That was what I think initially propelled me to go out and look, and then when it all went strange, I think the erotics of nature, I think the kind of the very complicated relationships that we have to things around us, you know, the feelings that you have when you watch a spider and it flies by a spider's web, all those kinds of experiences of power, you know, killing things, exterminating things, all of those are incredibly interesting to think about, you know, but I didn't have a language yet.
With a Methodist church, so I completely relate to what I was really struck. You both were talking about epistemic pluralism, because that's really what you're touching on there. The fact that people of God have a different way of viewing the world. Yeah. Those, say, of science, politics, whatever other world. Yeah. And that pluralism is incredibly powerful in allowing us to see different things in the world. So if you think about the religious tradition, it's got very strong, not widely understood, but it's got a very strong sense of humility around it in the face of the power of God. And my father was from Newlyn as a Methodist minister, and he gave me such a love of Cornish hedges. Everything as a very small child.
Yeah.
And it was infused with a religiosity,
Yeah.
which allows you to see something that most science people were so dogmatic about their way of seeing the world.
Yeah.
Miss entirely, because they're, and I think it speaks to what Katrina was talking about in terms of epistemic injustice. We need to be really careful in these terms, because there isn't one way of seeing your world. We need to be alert to the pluralism in time and space. And so the shift in generations is really, so I'm very struck by my daughter's generation. She's 24, she knows nothing. Most of her friends have never been in a church. They have no sense of that whole different way of being in the world. And what do you think about future? They've missed out pluralism. And that worries me in universities if we don't allow our spaces to be full of diverse ideas. And there's lots of tendencies now, just in my career, that are narrowing what it's acceptable to talk about and to think about, and that's really highly damaging to lots of things.
It's interesting. So humility is interesting one. Abjectness is another. I used to go around saying, I'm worthless, I'm worthless. And I'm just almost trying to cancel myself out to the point where I have a kind of, I would be filled with what I was looking at because I'd so raised myself. But of course, that brought huge psychological pain later in my life. So, anyway, it's a complicated thing. But yeah, it's very interesting, that tradition. We're getting an instrument with which to think. I think that was the first thing, to begin conceptualizing a relationship to the natural world, which I then kind of left behind. But that seemed to wonder. Yeah, it wasn't down at 4th Street Methodist. They were not doing it. I consider myself very lucky to have or Bible Christian. They weren't bringing in the microscope, so it was a kind of mixed picture. Any other questions? I think that's my time.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks.
I'm hoping this morning we are to some degree hitting the plurality box. Views and approaches. Up next is Lewis Elliott, who is talking about coastal environments, health and well-being. Lewis.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kevin. And yeah, you're sort of right to say these are diverse talks. I don't think this could be more different in the sense of the two previous, but it's nice that we're all united by a similar kind of aim, I suppose, and it's what's amazing that we can work in this similar project together. So I'm Lewis Elliott. I'm an environmental psychologist, so I'm interested in the way that different kind of environments make us think, feel and behave. And a lot of my research in recent years has focused particularly on coastal and marine environments. So I'm going to focus on that kind of biome today. But actually a lot of the kind of health outcomes and mechanisms, interventions and moderators and things like that can be applied to all kinds of natural environments as well. No, that's fine. That's what I'll go on to anyway. So, I mean, the first thing to say is this isn't anything new. So people were talking about the benefits of coastal environments for our health and well-being back in the 1600s. So why am I here today talking to you about it again? I suppose is a good question. And I suppose the reason is partly because of the things we've been talking about. Our extinction of experience of natural environments and of nature in general has led to them not being conserved as much as we might like. And I suppose my route into saying why we should conserve those natural environments is because they're so good for our public health and our well-being. And it's really only in the last couple of decades that we've begun to really try and quantify that in a way that we think makes sense for public health policymakers. So that's why I'm still talking about it today. We had some sort of frameworks earlier which bear some resemblance to this one here. This is typically a way we've thought about interactions with blue spaces and our health and well-being, starting with things like exposure on the left-hand side, so the kind of places we live near and recreate in, the kind of interactions we might have with our coastal environments, which might be indirect. I see it out of my window, which I'm very fortunate to do. They could be incidental, like Kevin was talking about, cycling alongside somewhere, or they could be intentional, like I go to the beach purposefully for leisure and things like that. And those kinds of interactions can have different kind of mechanisms. They can do things like mitigate our harms. They can help us reduce our exposure to air pollution, if we're talking about green spaces, for example, or our exposure to sort of heat and things like that that might cause health harms. But they can also build capacities. That's what instauration is. They can elicit physical activity or support physically active ways of being, support connectedness with other people. And they can also restore capacities as well. So if we're feeling down, if we're feeling exhausted, natural environments might have the capacity to restore some of those things as well. And it's those kind of processes that lead to these larger health outcomes, physical and mental health, also planetary health and wellbeing behaviours, conservation behaviours and things like that as well. This whole process can feed into interventions as well, of course. So societal level interventions, local level interventions, and even sort of personal therapeutic interventions, they all affect how we interact with our coastal environments and our natural environments. And of course, at many stages of this process, we have things that might make these relationships work or not work. So some of those can be environmental factors, its accessibility, its cultural acceptability, weather, of course, environmental quality, but also individual factors like someone's socioeconomic status, sex, age, race, state of nature, connectedness, things like that. So all of those things can moderate whether these relationships can work or don't work. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the sort of broader background about coastal living, and then I'm going to talk specifically more about coastal interactions as well. So let's look at this kind of overall relationship first. What's the relationship between how close we live to the coast and our health and well-being? Well, actually, before I say that, I'm going to go back and say this is a very uncritical overview of this area of research. So most of the things I'm going to talk about is a good news story. That's not always the case, and we can ask me about that at the end. I'm also not going to focus so much on planetary health and well-being behaviours either, because I don't have time. But needless to say, the sort of similar relationships as you might expect exist there as well in the literature. This is broadly speaking the relationship we find in England. So this was data from the UK census in 2001, in which everyone is asked how they feel about their own health. And from that, we're able to work out how close people live to the coast in England, and we can associate that with relative levels of good or very good health compared to people reporting poor health. We find that people that live closest to the coast in England tend to report better health after you adjust for things like sex, age, and socioeconomic status. And I'm going to return to this later when I talk about these moderating effects. We also find that that's not just the case of, that's not just dictated by a kind of healthy retiree effect. So older, healthier people may be having the kind of resources to live in more pleasant environments, because we also see the same thing as we look at people over time. So these data are from longitudinal studies, which track people as they move home closer to and further from the coast. And we see that in those years where they live closer to the coast, those people tend to experience better mental health and better physical health as well. I'm really going to hurtle through these kind of slides. So like I say, very different from the previous talks, but I'm really going to try and hurtle through some data here. So there's different mechanisms, of course, that might affect this relationship between proximity and health. One is kind of reductions of harms. So these data are from Lisbon, and they look at heat-related mortality and find that people living within a closer proximity to the coast or to the Tagus estuary have lower incidence of heat-related mortality over extreme levels of temperature. So that's just one example. Of course, there's many others. I'm just going to focus on snapshots of the research today. We also find that proximity may be able to build some capacities as well. So these data are from Natural England's Monitor of Engagement with the Natural Environment Survey, in which people are asked to self-report their physical activity attainment in the last week. And we generically find that people living within a kilometre of the coast are those who are also most likely to report meeting healthy thresholds of physical activity, for example, as well, compared to living over 20 kilometres away. So let's talk a little bit more about sort of actual deliberate interactions with the coast, or I shouldn't say deliberate actually, because like I said, indirect, intentional and incidental interactions may all be important for our health and well-being. Let's start with kind of indirect things. So these are cases where we're not going to a natural environment, they just have impacts on our health and well-being, even through indirect exposure. So one way we can characterise that is a view through a window. So this study is from Wellington in New Zealand. And what they did here was essentially have elevation models that allowed them to determine the kind of view people had from the windows of their home. And what they did in this study was basically formed an association between the amount of visible blue space from their home, the amount of visible water, and a measure of psychological distress, which is a generic mental health measure. And as you might expect, they found that lower psychological distress was associated with a greater visibility of coastal blue space from their home. There's also mechanisms as well by which indirect interactions can affect health. So let's just look at one example here. So this is completely virtual, so no real interaction with the coast. This was just a small experimental study, and it had 3 conditions. You either watched Blue Planet 2 on a TV, you either watched it in a 360 headset where you could turn around and look at wonderful fish and everything, or you looked at it in a kind of VR sense where you could literally interact with things in the environment. And we found that it didn't really matter. Those 2 sort of more interactive conditions didn't really matter. But we found that they were better at eliciting feelings of presence in the environment, feelings of nature connectedness, improvements in positive mood and reductions in boredom as well. So again, these are virtual interactions, they're not real, but they confer some of the effects that we might be interested in terms of improving our health and well-being. There's of course good evidence to suggest that there's a relationship between intentional leisure time interactions and our health and well-being. This is from an 18 countries survey that we did a few years ago. And essentially these 2 sort of panels on the left here just display an association between the frequency with which someone visits the coast in the last month and their mental health on the y-axis there. You can see as people make more visits, mental health tends to improve and distress tends to deteriorate as well. What I want to kind of point out, and I said this is an uncritical overview, so one critical point is we don't find any associations with the probability of using medications for certain affective disorders like anxiety or depression. That might be because people are using these environments for self-medication, we don't know. But that's just one critical point, and there's certainly many other kind of mental health outcomes I could choose that don't display these positive associations in the literature. So again, intentional interactions might have the effect of building our capacities, building social connectedness and physical activity. So this is just one simple study I did many years ago that demonstrated that when we visit coastal environments compared to other types of natural environments, our levels of energy expenditure tend to be higher. If you live close to the coast, that is. If people coming from further away, you tend to have lower energy expenditure, sunbathing, eating ice cream, etc. But if you're visiting locally, you tend to use it for more health promoting resources like physical activity and walking. Also, these kind of intentional interactions might restore our capacities. So again, this is data from Natural England survey done many years ago now. But again, it displays the idea that coastal environments and indeed rural environments in this instance as well, they can promote things like a feeling of more relaxation, calmness, refreshed and revitalization. These are the kind of items they use in Natural England survey, over and above other types of more urbanized natural environments as well. And this is just a sort of classic study in the area as well. So where they have people download an iPhone app that ping them at certain points of the day and ask them how happy they were feeling. And while they did that, they logged their location. And essentially what they could detect here was that when you're in marine and coastal margins, you tend to feel the happiest of all the kinds of environments that you visit. The nice thing about this data is it's within individuals, so they can compare individuals in different environments throughout the day. And so just to give that some context, the difference between urban and marine environments in terms of eliciting happiness is about the same as visiting an exhibition or going to a gig versus doing housework. So it gives you some kind of something to relate to in terms of the magnitude of difference. So also want to talk a little bit about the modifiers of these effects as well. So the things that can make these relationships work and not work. So let's return to that very first study then. What we see here is a breakdown of this relationship by socioeconomic status. Actually, I should say area level deprivation. And what we find actually is this pattern of being closer to the coast, living close to the coast, promoting better health and well-being is most pronounced in the most deprived populations of the country. So in other words, the least affluent. We see no such picture here with the least deprived populations in the country. So relationships there. So again, this shows that actually in coastal living might have some impact on mitigating health inequalities as well. And as you'll see from other studies, this is kind of what we see with regards to some of these other health mechanisms. So this is a study done by Joe Garrett, who's with us today. And essentially what you can see here is that coastal proximity seems to be more important for physical activity attainment, particularly walking behaviour in the lowest income quintiles as well. Although, again, a caveat there is we didn't see the same pattern when we looked at objective physical activity. This only applies to self-reported things. That's what those bars there show. And similarly, again, by Joe as well. So thanks, Joe, for providing me with so many useful slides. But again, this is data from the Health Survey for England. And in this study, Joe found that living within 5 kilometres was associated with lower overall mental health scores and less risk of depression. But again, only for those on the lowest income levels, so only on those in the top bar there. So another kind of health inequality effect. There's also these kind of situational modifiers, things about the environment that might affect our relationships between exposures to coasts and well-being. So let's look at this kind of part of the puzzle now. So again, this is an indirect study. They're just looking at photos on a screen and videos on a screen, so it's not a real exposure. But this study recruited, it was actually funded by the RSPB, and they recruited a large sort of sample of participants online to rate different photos. And these have different levels of kind of species abundance. So they could be low, they could be moderate, or they could be high. And they also kind of rated videos that had what they call different levels of fascination. So basically where the animals were not doing much at all, or doing very sort of charismatic kinds of behaviours, you know, seals being cute and cuddly, gannets swooping, moths flocking and things like that. And essentially what they found was that higher abundance of biodiversity and higher fascination environments, i.e. more charismatic behaviours, were associated with relatively high levels of valence, which is kind of positive mood, and what we call arousal, which is not a useful term, but it kind of means sort of more energized feelings. I should say that all of these scenes were rated positively, but I'm just talking about kind of relative sort of things. So you can see these empty biomes here without any biodiversity were pretty low arousal, whereas things with biodiversity and high levels of abundance were associated with relatively high levels of arousal. Again, there's kind of, oh, it's Joe again. So thanks, Joe, for your third study featuring here. But this was a recent study which was looking, you know, particularly at different types of coastal environments, biomes, and the different ways in which our interactions with them might promote subjective well-being. So here, for example, Joe finds differences even between different types of coastal environments. So cliffs, shores, and beaches seem to promote higher subjective well-being on average than open seas, harbours, and marinas. Now, of course, this is very crude. This is at a population level. Sorry, Joe, it's not very crude, it's great. But, you know, this is population level stuff. And of course, you can have meaningful interactions with those environments as well. But this is the kind of patterns we find, at least on this 18-country level. What's quite nice here as well is Joe looked at different perceived qualities of visits to coastal environments and indeed other blue spaces, and found here, for example, that a perception of safety seems to matter a lot more to subjective well-being than other kind of perceived aspects of the experience. Given that we're here, I should mention the wildlife one, which is quite interesting because it promotes greater happiness the more wildlife you perceive. It also promotes greater anxiety the more wildlife you perceive as well. And that might be to do with characteristics of the people or the characteristics of the environment, but nonetheless, wildlife can have those different kind of effects that Kevin was talking about in his introductory talk. So lastly, I want to focus a little bit on interventions. So the things that can basically change the way in which we interact with our coastal environments. So let's look at societal ones to begin with. So this was just a little study we did, and it was based on the EU's bathing water directive and the signage associated with that bathing water directive. So if you go to a designated bathing water, you should see one of these signs. It might be hidden away, but you should see it. And essentially what we did in this study was we asked people how they rated the sort of the environment that they last visited in terms of water quality. And then we said, how many more or how many fewer recreational visits would you make to that environment if it improved in quality or if it deteriorated in quality, and showed them the associated sort of pictogram there. What we're interested in here is calculating people's sort of travel cost to different types of environments, and then associating that with, well, what would happen if across the population, so this was around 80% of the adult population of the EU, what would happen if those changes were borne out by those contingent improvements or deteriorations? And we found that increases in water quality were associated with around 42 billion euros of added value per year across that adult population of the EU. But decreases in water quality are associated with a loss of around 131 billion. So that's because we sort of value more things that we hold. So psychologically speaking, we value things that we hold. We don't know about things we haven't got yet, but we know what we've got. And if we lose it, that relates to a greater sort of drop in these kinds of behaviours. So it's called prospect theory, that sort of basic theory. There's also kind of local level interventions that we've looked at. So this is just an example of one which we did in Plymouth. There's a kind of sort of coastal park in a sort of relatively deprived ward of Plymouth. And this kind of was a community-led sort of co-creation design. We asked them what they'd like to see from this space, and then had landscape architects on the team, which are kind of able to make it happen essentially. And so it went from this kind of area to this kind of area. And, you know, we're very aware of the kind of gentrification issues that might arise from that and things, but we tried to make it as community-led as we could. And we did some very sort of basic before and after surveying of the local community. And generally speaking, we found that kind of recent measures of subjective well-being improved after the intervention. But probably most importantly, the reason that we found that they improved because people perceive their community as more cohesive. So alongside all of this stuff, there was a load of social activity going on, efforts from the council and the aquarium and other stakeholders to get people together. And that's what people really valued. But again, that wouldn't exist without the space itself. So it's about how that space is designed in certain ways to elicit those kinds of social activities. And lastly, there's a series of kind of literatures now on kind of personal and therapeutic interventions with blue space. This is just one systematic review of those kinds of interventions. I think the takeaway finding from that is we don't have anywhere near the kind of evidence that you might have for other RCTs of typical kind of things like cognitive behavior therapy or drugs and pharmacological interventions for improving mental health. They just don't apply to this kind of research, which is typically led by charities and NGOs and things like that, which, you know, is completely understandable. They don't have the kinds of budgets the kind of medical research has to do these sorts of things. Nonetheless, it's popular, it's happening, and we've now got a kind of 4-year project looking at this sort of thing in a lot more detail across Europe as well. So doing RCTs in this kind of area, trying to produce evidence that we think will be useful to kind of bodies like NICE, for instance, National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. That's a boring summary, so I'm not going to read through it. What I am going to do instead is just, so with my other hat on, and just because I've heard some things today, so my other hat is kind of a health psychologist that's interested in persuasive health messaging and the ways in which we talk to people about their health. And I'm just kind of minded, I don't want to be too critical or anything, but I'm minded about things like blindness and the way we've talked about plant blindness in history. Intergenerational blindness is something I learned today. Nature deficit disorder is another common narrative. All of those things are kind of emphasizing a sort of tragedy model of disability, which I think is problematic. Extinction of experience, less so, but all of those terms are quite negative. I've just talked about all the positive stuff and the value of these kinds of experiences for our health and well-being. So while those terms might work internally while we talk about these things, I think we have to be careful about using them with other people and actually flipping it around to talking about the value of nature experience, the benefits of nature experience, rather than its extinction might be a useful way to go. But that's just an opinion, and I'm happy to be challenged on that. Thanks very much. Happy to ask any.
Thank you very much, Lewis. Questions? Go for it.
Anxiety of wildlife, is it the fact that in this country we don't have sort of big carnivores, wolves, bears, which actually could potentially harm you? Has there been research done on that in like the UK, how the lack of those animals actually affect the way we think about those spaces?
That's a good question. I'd have to confess I don't know if that research has been done. I suspect those findings are much more to do with the kinds of environments that people who report anxiety are visiting. I suspect they're systematically different to the ones which promote happiness. I don't know if Joe, you have an opinion on that, given we did the research.
This was research out of just the UK. So there would be environments where it might be like it's not yeah, I would just think
I'm aware that people didn't hear that online, but we talked about the idea of insect bites and those more common things potentially eliciting anxiety. Thanks, Joe. Yeah.
So to the studies where you're using in virtual reality or showing images,
yeah.
Are you looking at the effects immediately after, and is it after like a single interaction? And are there studies where you do like several sessions until you see a formative impact on feeling?
Yeah. So the question was about the experiments about indirect experiences of nature, where people rate photos and videos or have virtual interactions with nature, and whether they only represent short-term effects. So the answer is yes. Most of that research has been done in a short-term capacity, so acute experiments, interventions. So there are kind of efforts to use virtual reality as a kind of intervention for example, palliative care patients who literally can't access the outdoors. And there's also there's good evidence on the benefits, for example, of indoor horticulture and things. So again, not a direct experience of nature, but indoor horticulture, specifically in older populations. So we did a systematic review of that kind of thing, and they are longer term interventions. But we find that the effects of those interventions on health and well-being are pretty much inseparable from the idea of having something social to do in those settings. So the ways in which those interventions work is to do with eliciting social contact, which is obviously beneficial for health and well-being. But that's not to downplay the role that nature has. So that nature is bringing about those kind of benefits to health. So, yeah. Kelly. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Is there anything known about, or do you anticipate changes in people's experiences of well-being by the existing climate change? People as the sea levels, stormy damage.
Yes. So you've allowed me a window in to talk about some of the negatives, which is nice. So interestingly, in a much earlier paper in New Zealand, Tasciano Milfont finds an association between coastal living and climate change concern. But one of the kind of caveats he points out there is that could be good, because it means that people living in these environments are more exposed to those kinds of environmental changes, and maybe they want to do something about it. But he also suggests, because he's a psychologist, that it might lead to what we call learned helplessness, which is an ineffective way of kind of motivating goal pursuits around environmental behaviour. So if you feel helpless, you don't tend to do things to make a change because you feel it's out of your hands, sort of thing. And also, if you kind of read the kind of Chief Medical Officer's report on the health and coastal communities that was published just over a year ago, that's one of his key concerns. Coastal communities are at the forefront of environmental change, and that will probably lead to basically more inequalities between those populations and those living in relatively unscathed kind of inland areas, I suppose. So I think it's one of the challenges, and yeah, so I think it's an issue.
Got two questions in the chat, if that's all right.
Yep.
One is from Daniel Barrios O'Neill. Are coastal proximity effect sizes meaningful for health? How do they get access to these space?
Yeah, so I'll take the second part first. I don't tend to like to separate the effect sizes for green space and health to blue space and health, because they obviously overlap. Blue spaces often have a lot of vegetation, green spaces often have water. So I don't tend to like to make that comparison. Obviously, the thing about green space is it's more easily modifiable. You can't bring a coast inland, for example, but you can modify green space to have different qualities, to rewild it, etc., etc., etc. So I think a kind of, not to dismiss the question, but the better question is green spaces are more amenable to different kinds of health impacts than coasts are. But to take the first part of the question about whether they're meaningful for public health, the effect sizes in these epidemiological studies are always small. But at a population level, if you're, for example, take those economic studies, or for example, studies that we've done looking at coastal recreation and its impacts on physical activity, we find, for example, annually, even water sports, which are basically only available to a very select part of the population, still worth around £380 million a year in terms of health cost savings. So I think those effects, while small at a population level, they still have meaning for things like health cost savings. Yeah.
Can you say something about how these research results have been taken up by the policy and caring communities?
Say yes, all of those things are true, but there are benefits as well. So to try and kind of redress some of that balance in policy reporting. And similarly, we've done things for the kind of World Health Organization. So looking at their kind of reports on biodiversity and health and urban green spaces and health, and saying there is also this blue angle. And, I don't want to sort of attribute it to just our research, because this is completely, the research done worldwide. But the kind of recent shift in the definitely 25-year environment plan policy was a specific focus. The headline was on green and blue spaces. And I think that was, one area where we can say, hopefully the research that's done internationally in this kind of area of coast, blue space and health has led to those kind of very, very small tweaks in wider environmental policy. With regards to care, I assume they're sort of talking about kind of social care or mental health care, therapeutic care, I don't know. So I think that's still in its infancy. Part of the reason is because we don't have the evidence that kind of health and care commissioners tend to require to say this is a valuable intervention. The last thing I want to do as a scientist is say, go and throw yourself in the sea, it'll be great. And actually that can cause a lot more problems than it does goods. So I think, yeah, we have to be very careful before, even though we know these associations at a population level, at an epidemiologic scale, I don't think you can kind of take those and directly translate them into health and care sort of scenarios yet. I don't have time, but yeah.
Yes, one more. Love to. Just, I'm interested in your plea at the end about framing.
Yes.
And whether there's been much, and that's been a live debate for 5 or 10 years about how ecologists might talk to kind of elicit responses and pace and that sort of change. But I wonder if there's any, and I imagine the marketing literature and the commercial literature is right with how you message to elicit responses. And I wonder whether that has actually been systematically looked at in this context, in how we frame, who we frame for, and the social demographic ways we to get penetration where we want it to.
So I think it's been systematically looked at with mainly in health issues. So my knowledge of that is mainly in health issues and how we frame that. And what tends to be the case is this kind of Goldilocks effect of a little bit of fear is good. So a little bit of fear prompts action, but mostly people respond better to hopeful messages, especially when it regards their own health and well-being. That's also been looked at a little bit with climate change as well, and climate change reporting in the media. Obviously, we have very little control over what newspapers and things publish. That's kind of their own guidance and what sells papers and things like that. But there's been lots of content analysis work. Now, your question's very pertinent because Em, who sat right there, is doing her PhD on exactly this topic with myself and Kevin and others. But with regards to biodiversity change and how we think about the future, what might be a useful way of thinking about the future versus a sort of maladaptive way. So yeah, watch this space, I suppose.
Okay, that's good. Thank you, Rosh. So as I think many of you will know, the university has a strategic relationship with the National Trust. The National Trust is also a partner on the Renew project. And so it's great. Our last speaker today is Alex Hunt from the National Trust, and he's going to be talking about the People's Assembly for Nature, which some of you may have heard of, and is an incredibly important initiative in this whole space. Alex.
So this is what I want to talk about, which is personalised ecologies in a collective process. So this is about a whole multitude, when you bring the nation together, the kind of ecologies that you have there, but also kind of how that works in an interesting way in a collective process. I'm going to be entirely speculative and anecdotal. This is a very fresh piece of work. We only just finished publishing the People's Plan for Nature last week. It's something that we've been doing since October, November last year. It's going to be content heavy. I hope the video works because it's pretty key for some of what you will take away from today. Conclusions lie, and it's really a personal view from an observer of that process. So I've been lurking and observing the process, supporting the process, but not necessarily embedded totally within it. So what am I talking about? Well, I'm going to talk about the first two parts of this, which is something that we did, which was called the National Conversation, which was a process where we went to the nation to ask them some catalytic questions about nature. And then about the People's Assembly for Nature, a deliberative process where we talked about a brighter future for nature and shaped some recommendations through that. You'll see some logos at the bottom. So our role in this process as RSPB, WWF and National Trust is sponsored of the process, but it was actually delivered by a number of different organisations at the bottom there. Sortition Foundation, which specialises in finding representative samples through democratic lotteries, so a way of actually getting the right people into this kind of process. Involve, a charity that specialises in deliberative democracy, is a world leader in that kind of process. The New Citizen Project, which is a small organisation that brings some interesting perspectives about how do you engage people as citizens rather than consumers. And then 89, a creative agency that helped us really sort of think about how do you use creative assets and bring the process to life in a way which actually really engages people overall. I'm not going to talk about the later bits of this, but you can see where we're heading with it, which is we've launched the People's Plan for Nature. That was last week. We, as organisations, so the National Trust, RSPB, WWF, are as much subject to the citizens' recommendations as anyone, and so we'll be responding in full to that. And later, fairly soon, you'll see us also really wanting to get behind the People's Plan. You know, this, in asking this process, the citizens have come through with something really interesting that we think needs to be heard and talked about. The video I was about to play to you, I shall describe, which was an uplifting video in which we intercepted people in the street and asked them about nature across the 4 nations. And it sort of brings to life that sense of quite different views about nature, a sense of hope, sense of some futility, a sense of joy, a sense of what it brings into people's lives. Some people find it easy to talk about, some people finding it less easy. So we used that video as a way to introduce people into the national conversation. We did this through social media. We also worked through a number of locations through the Future Arts Network. So these are arts institutions that specialise in good engagement with different kinds of communities. And we set out 3 catalytic questions within that. So, what do you love about nature in the UK, and what would you miss about it if it disappeared? Imagine it's 2050 and nature in the UK is thriving. What's different from now? We also asked them for some exciting examples of what they've seen around nature restoration. That conversation brought in over 20,000 online submissions from over 7,000 people across England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. We had people add leaves onto leaves onto some trees that we put up in these art centres, which had those questions on where they could leave their feedback. And you see the number of trees that we had in those different places. So you kind of capture a wide range of personal ecologies via that national conversation. I've just created a few random hashtags there of the kinds of things that I saw, and that's just, you know, a drop in the ocean, just the sheer variety of the kinds of things that we saw. I'm going to share a few examples which are sort of touchstones of some of the themes that we saw. So here you have someone sounding pretty engaged with nature. They talk about ospreys, otters, seagulls, sound like someone that knows quite a fair amount about nature, but about the peace it brings, the sense of change in seasons, but also this thing around the interrelationship with family and the role it plays with them and engaging with their children. This one, rather different actually, is around sense of identity and belonging. That, you know, it's in my place, in my blood. It's the place I've known, 5th generation. As I walk these narrow roads and bridleways, I have this intense emotional connection to the land, the trees, the hedgerows, the ancient homes that watched over this community through good times and bad. This is what I would miss. This sense of a really different kind of, you know, place-driven, place-connected form of nature. And then this one, more of an urban one. So for those who live in urban areas, it provides green space where you can enjoy the changing seasons, get away from the crowds, breathe fresh air, observe wildlife in its entirety, and exercise away from traffic, all of which have been a huge benefit to one's mental health. So we took all of these pieces out, or just step back a bit, actually, illustrations. What we wanted to do, we took these verbatums from the huge array of input, and we did not analyse it as well. But we brought some out and wanted to illustrate them to create almost these parables, these visual representations of these ideas as a different way to kind of get people to engage and illustrate that. We took those into the Citizen Assembly, which I'm just about to talk about, and the first thing on arrival that the citizens saw when they arrived for part of this process was a gallery of these views, a gallery of those verbatums, and these interesting little interpretations of sort of little metaphors for people's connection with nature. That's one of my favourite bird pals. I really like the way that one works. So, People's Assembly for Nature. I'm going to stop for a second and just talk about, well, what are citizen assemblies? So I guess we're in a moment of quite new and different ways of participating in democracy, deliberative democracy. And that really lies at the heart of the reason why we as 3 organisations commissioned this process. We felt, well, the nature crisis affects absolutely everyone. Everyone needs a voice in that. How do we channel that and bring that together in a positive and proactive way, which sort of charts the way for the future? So the key features of citizen assemblies is they're a representative sample of the population. And that's an interesting concept to define when you have these kinds of samples, and I'll talk a little bit more about how we did that. They're about learning, deliberation and discussion and making decisions together, actually, so co-decision making. It's about evidence, so it's about people hearing a good range of accurate, balanced and comprehensive evidence about a situation or overall. And they tend to work in controversial, morally complex, constitutional, quite difficult topic areas. So there have been a number of these already. There's the UK Climate Assembly, which we took inspiration from. In Ireland, there's a citizen assembly that was on abortion, a really vexed topic in Ireland, which charted a new approach and a change in legislation. There's a National Assembly for Wales. There's a Scottish Citizen Assembly and Climate Assembly, and also the Republic of Ireland, I was just reading back yesterday, just completed as a Children's Assembly for Nature. Really interesting view and actually their recommendations, a beautiful reflection of what we have from adults coming from childhood is fabulous. So what was it? It was 100 strong, a representative sample of UK citizens answering this question: what should we do to protect and restore nature in the UK? And what we asked them to do was to look at what we called system actors. So this was government, so national and devolved government, local authorities, food businesses, but also actually other kinds of businesses as well. And then NGOs like my own, the National Trust, RSPB, other ones that are playing a role in this, and then communities and individuals themselves. So this was the heart of their deliberation. How did we get those 100 people? We sent out 33,000 invitations on a random, stratified random sample basis through the Royal Mail system for targeting post to recruit overall 107. Those people were selected against a number of criteria. This is where Sortition Foundation came in. And if you go to sortition, it's in the dictionary, it's a word, and it is a technical term for how you select people through democratic lottery to engage a representative sample of the population. When I say a representative sample of the population, it's of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Here's where we cheated. So the things that we did change was if you were to fill this room with the nation, it would be overly represented by London and the South East. So we took a little bit of the London and South East away, and we reapportioned that for certain forms of diversity, and also to make sure that Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales had more of a sense of equilibrium within the room. So we did work with the sample, but it is a broadly representative sample. We also selected as well against a number of ranges of factors, so ethnicity, age, rural versus urban, and the one other thing that was critical was we also selected based on nature connection. So an index of nature connection was a part of that selection process. We didn't want a room full of people that put their hand up and go, well, of course I'm going to spend time to talk to you about nature. No, this is about people that also weren't necessarily engaged with nature. We retained 103 of the members of the Assembly through the process, which is a pretty good retention rate in terms of it was a process over 4 weekends, face-to-face on the first weekend and last weekend in Birmingham. 2 weekends in the middle were online. We had 36 hours of deliberation and a huge amount of travel for people around that to get to it. We took in 40 expert perspectives, so this is sort of an interesting thing around this is where the ecologies are beginning to collide. We had 45 quotes and illustrations that we used as that inspiration within the process, and we drew in 18 experts from an independent advisory group to help us think about the evidence and how we brought that to the people. I won't go into a lot of detail here, but this was how it worked, which is weekend one was a fast immersion into kind of the state of nature. What is it? What is nature to start off with? Why? What state is it in? Why has it got there? Who's responsible? What are the processes that have an impact on that? And that was a very fast depth immersion into that. The weekend two was around protecting and restoring nature. It was about kind of, how do we manage our land and seas? What are the protections that we have afforded for them? Do they work? Where don't they work? Why might that be the case? How are we connected to nature as people? Why does that matter? And what are we doing around restoring nature? What's working, not working? Where might we draw inspiration? Third weekend was around sustaining people and nature. We got a lot into kind of food, fisheries, farming, and the systems and what we're asking of nature and how do we sustain ourselves. We got into a bit about diet as well. And we talked about fairness and how do we fairly reduce pressures, redesign systems and restore nature. And the final weekend was the citizens taking all of that. They've been deliberating throughout. So the format for this is they were given a range of presentations. I'll talk about that in a second. They were able to deliberate on those presentations. Over the weeks, they accumulated what they thought were the things that needed to happen. And in the final weekend, they deliberated on that to make their selection on what they felt needed to happen. So yes, this is the multi-layered personal ecologies that you kind of got in this process, which I think is interesting. So those 100 citizens, I really want to get the video to work because this is really key for you to really get the flavour of what that's about. What does it feel like when you get and the nation in the room. It really is to feel like that. I was present. It felt very much like that, and a real range of different backgrounds, a range of real very different life experiences from across the UK. Fundamental. These people were sitting together, talking together, deliberating together around a set of issues that not necessarily they were expert in at all, but through the process that they became more knowledgeable and aware about. We had a whole amazing team of facilitators. So these people weren't necessarily nature campaigners or anything like that. These were people that professionally facilitate these kinds of processes. They each brought their own kind of personal ecologies with that, and they were a very diverse group as well. We had an advisory group that we again wanted to maximise the diversity of that, and so you won't make out the faces on there, but we had academics within that group, and then particularly academic advisors to make sure that the evidence was solid within what we had. But we had people from land-based organisations, CLA, NFU Wales. We had people from government agencies. We had people from community groups flocked together. Lots of interesting, different new community groups that are emerging around nature. We had Thomasina Myers, who founded Oaxaca, and so a chef and coming from that food business background, alongside a lot of other different kinds of skills as well within that. And then we had the speakers. So this was the heart of the deliberation, really, was it's out kind of 12 days of Christmas, 9 academics, 9 NGOs, 6 farmers, 3 independent consultants. So what you had in that, and just to bring that to life, is the 6 farmers are all got very different personal ecologies. You know, you've got livestock farmers, 7th generation Welsh farmer, versus a farmer who, through his wife, has inherited the farm and is doing some extraordinary things to restore soil within that. Within that, you had people who were planners in local authorities versus working on communities. We had someone who'd been doing a project around how to change house building to make more ecologically, just to increase the ecology that you get through development. You had a local food partnership as well. You know, really quite a range of different people, all coming with a set of different personal ecologies that they brought into their presentations, which I think are amazing. I'll also say that all of this is totally online. So every single presentation that the citizens saw, and I would say this is probably the equivalent of at least the first year, if not second year of university, kind of in the span of what they've taken. I would absolutely say go and look at the content. It's academically useful content for students to see. It was just an astonishing array that we were able to take the citizens through, and also through that, as we listened to them, we changed a little bit of the process as we went along. So there was a sense of, can we hear more from practitioners, people that are having to make difficult decisions where livelihoods are at stake, and how do we understand that as well? I can just pause for a moment and take 1 or 2 questions before I play the video. Is there anything?
What kind of expenses and fees did you?
Oh yeah, so
it wasn't economically expensive.
Yeah, so that inclusion was really important for us. So everyone was paid a fixed fee of £800. Made sure that as well as that £800 fee, we paid travel expenses, and that was also addressed. We also made sure that if people needed assistance, carers, or anyone who needs to be with them, that was also covered. And we also made sure that the technology, because some of it was going to be online, that we were able to work with them, supply technology so they could participate in the process, recognising that not everyone has access or skills to that. And so involved the organisation we worked with, had technology coaches that would work with the citizens to get them prepped for the weekends, to make sure that it was totally inclusive. Okay, over there.
So in the adventure, I've never really done anything like this before. My name is Chantal. I'm a support worker. My name is Alvin. I come from Northern Ireland. And my job is to have Right, my name is Jane. I work as a tutor in France. My name is Josie. I'm from Swansea and I'm a carer. I'm happy to be a trip for nature's sake. I'm a doctor. I care about people. I want to change nature and have it improve so that it will improve our lives. As someone with visual impairment, hearing sounds in nature is quite important for me. In my upbringing, I haven't had too much access to nature. I would like more of it, and I'd like to protect it. Some of the stories from the speakers, brought me to tears. I couldn't believe how bad things were, but we've had to start somewhere. is the cornerstone of resilient landscapes.
15% of species in this country are threatened with extinction. Extinction has happened, is happening, and it's accelerating. What you're doing today is absolutely critical.
Making sure these, keeping what we can do, sure that data actually has a seat at the table is a huge thing to me.
If I completely different viewpoints, I'm happy to work for that.
It's got quite heated, there's been a lot of ideas.
I thought my opinions were pretty fixed and firm, and then through conversations with the diversity of people in the room, my opinions were moved to consider other points of view.
To effectively protect the new nature of the UK, we call for
urgent restoration of boundaries to this.
We call for a legal right to equitable access to nature.
Civil reduction in the allocation issue models.
More positive. I can make it an individual. I need to become like some sort of ambassador. I was going to talk to my husband association. I was thinking around lots of certificates for every day. Even when it's small like that, it's helping.
But I do believe changes that can come primarily from the government level. We have come together, discussed everything, and the end result of that is that we want change and that we want nature to be restored, renewed, and protected here.
This is what we want, not lip service, not greenwashing, but real change.
One sec, Claire. Just up.
Every one of those gigs is.
It's not like my presentation, but
We are down to me.
it looks very good.
I thought it was such a cool opportunity.
I've never really get back to
anything like this before.
There we go.
And then.
Next window. Actually, give them the presentation.
I think that's your. How is it?
Let's see if we.
Right.
On.
There you are. If I close this.
Sorry about that again. There is one more video, but I'm not going to play it. So it's a very loose hypothesis, but an ecology shared is an ecology squared. So I think the power of this process, and you heard there that the views were moved, sense of connection with nature began to shift, is that it's more powerful because of the multiple forms of diversity that we brought together in that room. So expert voices with ordinary citizens, people from very different backgrounds and walks of life, age groups, bringing them together was really key. The other thing as well is it ticks every box of kind of, I think about, the 5 ways to well-being, that there was a shared experience and a kind of a citizenship in there that through learning and deliberation does create change. It creates space for people to change because of that process. But what's really key to that is that we treated people as citizens, not consumers of nature. So there's an interesting thing there about that they have agency and they have a role to play and can help us shape a different future for nature. And also what was interesting, that even when consensus may be hard, that we were able to find common ground, that there is something that was achieved through that.
Take back a note.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, does it?
Yeah, I think that might be the problem. Just needs to click. Taking it out.
There we go. So results are very tentative. We've got evaluation going on. And here's some of the changes that we measured. And, this is a 4-month process. First of all, we saw a change in knowledge. So this is from weekend 1 when they arrived to weekend 4 when they completed. This is the first statement is, I know a lot about nature in the UK, or I know quite a lot. You see that sudden vast increase in terms of, okay, there were some learning outcomes. They did learn and they had a sense of, they knew about it. Then we asked them, well, have we lost a higher percentage of our nature and wildlife than most any other country in the world? And you see again that change in knowledge. So there's something that we did there, which is that their knowledge ecology has changed. So there is something about this process which does create knowledge change. For me, this was just more a qualitative measure of that, which is we asked them a little bit as we were towards the end of the process. This post-it note completely encapsulated, which is the last 3 weekends have opened my eyes. Why was I so unaware of the situation? A new approach needed. And this was the sense of that through the trajectory of the weekends, they went from feeling not knowing much about nature or even thinking that nature was perfectly fine to knowing that it wasn't and that we needed to make a real big change about it. We also measured some very tentative signs of changing personal ecologies, behaviours, shall we say. And again, remembering this is just a 4-month process that we went through, is an uplift in kind of starting to read more about nature, beginning to talk a bit more about nature. This is a percentage uplift between the 2 measurements. Watching or listening nature programs and then taking steps to do something. Qualitatively, we heard a bit more and some things that they're beginning to talk to and things that they want to do. And also as part of the process, we've been engaging them in an onward journey from this to ask what role do they want to play about in the People's Plan that they've published. So this is the People's Plan, released last week. There are 26 powerful calls to action in the plan. Based on their deliberation, they said that we need a fundamental change in how we value nature in the UK, mandating the inclusion of nature in decision-making at all levels. There should be no more harm to nature, and for the UK-wide and regional targets to be set to renew nature and increase biodiversity. That's a drop in the ocean in terms of the detail. They made recommendations in areas of vision and leadership, around regulation and implementation, recommendations around nature-friendly farming and food production and consumption, a set of recommendations around coastal waters and protections for those, and catchment management of waterways. Also recommendations about local access to nature, in particular urban access to nature, and some recommendations around actually how we use evidence effectively to change the future for nature. What was also interesting, though, are some new collective ecologies that they brought together through this process in terms of the visions that they talked about, and these are thematically what they had was about this is what they want. This is what the outcome, if we get the plan right, is the world that they want to live in, which is one in which nature is woven into everyday life. Cities are filled with wild wilderness. It is common to see animals move safely in a city and town. The air is clean in cities. On a day in the office, at least 5 different bugs fly, creep, or squirrel all over you. Abundance and biodiversity. Fewer bare hills and overgrazing, more woodlands, meadows, and green spaces teeming with wildlife. All our towns and cities cloaked in green, from tree-lined streets and green roofs to parks linked by walking paths and cycleways. Significant areas protected throughout the countryside. Rich in biodiversity, where we can find a place as one species amongst many. Resources and production. 100% green energy owned by the government. Windmills everywhere, wave turbine machines, rewilded farms and arts communities, sustainable eco-building allowing to create new villages, cities with hydroponic farms in every basement and green roofs everywhere. A network of green corridors and funding to provide green space to join these up even further. Ponds on every street providing drainage, earth gullies with wildflowers lining every pavement, leaves swept into official compost heaps in every corner. What a glorious mess. Ethos. People aren't exploiting nature for profit. The way we live is alongside nature, not trying to dominate it, like making sure the roads don't stop animals crossing, our industry doesn't pollute their habitats. And then economic policy and design. Creation of a People's Parliament for environmental protection and enhancement to aid people empowerment and counter peer pressure from industry and our politicians that erode such protections. Much greater criminal laws bringing accountability against polluters and businesses that flout environmental standards. So you can see, through this process, they came to some very, very strong opinions and conclusions collectively. This is the next video. I will probably, is it going to let me? I'm going to see if I can move across.
My name is Adibo.
My name's Rebecca.
My name is Alvin. Fine.
Okay.
Jack.
Holly, Juan, Josie.
We're from all corners of the UK.
Your next door neighbour,
Your colleague, your mother,
your train driver,
your retired teacher, your youth worker.
and your friend.
We've learned UK nature is in crisis. We've listened to the evidence.
And talked about what would be fair.
What would work for everyone and what we could get our future.
So we've come together to share our vision.
The future of nature and how we can all work together to protect and restore it. Our community, for our grandchildren,
For our health, for our climate,
for our rivers, for our oceans,
for our planet, for our home.
created a plan.
Too big to ignore. Help us turn our vision to life.
Alex, and thank you for battling through the challenges. Charlie.
Very much for this, it's really interesting. It's worth reading, especially to see some of what was said here about profit, domination of nature, connection between profit and domination of nature. I found that particularly interesting from a sociological standpoint. Anyway, my question is, because there are a lot being discussed about power relations and how much those relations frame how it is that we live today and how important they are to address in order to understand how it is that we might live in the future.
Yeah, so that came through in some of the presenters. There was one particular example, I think. So I'll name it in this room because it's somewhat controversial, but it's a major multinational food producer on a river valley, which is very heavily polluted, producing huge numbers of chickens. And there was a bit of a wow moment. And a sense of, so what you're telling me is that enterprise, because that business model, can afford to pollute rivers to the point of almost destroying it, and the regulation doesn't seem to do anything about it. So there were elements where the citizens heard evidence, where they heard about systems where there was things like that. At the other end of the spectrum, a farmer talking about the multiple generations in which he had worked, the challenges he faced in trying to be more nature friendly, the feeling he had as someone very attached to the soil that he worked, that he was doing the right thing, but yet also this sense of that if we want to aim higher for nature, there is a social justice element, a fairness about that. So there was a sense, and there was a particular elements of recommendations were about fairness and trying to find a way of creating fairness in the way that we change. But they also heard from an economist about something called the Shirker's Triangle. Have you come across this? So the Shirker's Triangle is very interesting and very easy to understand, which is you've got government, you've got business, and you've got the citizens. And the government points at the citizens and said, you need to change what you're doing. Citizens say, government, you need to do that. Government says, well, business, you do that. Business says, well, the citizens aren't going to do it, so you can't tell us to do it. So you end up with this real sense of a fragmentation where everyone points at the other person, say, you need to move first or make the change. So a lot of the recommendations I feel when I've read them are often about trying to bring that tension of the different actors together to try and break that Shirker's Triangle. So it is a sense of yes, trying to stop that blame game and accountability, slopey shoulders thing and try and crack through that. So they definitely got that in their recommendations.
So presentations or expert witnesses ever presenting evidence or some direct prediction?
It's a really good question, actually. There was an element after we'd gone through the first weekend that the citizens were wanting to sort of hear the other side. And when we probed into that, what they wanted to hear was more about how it worked for practitioners. They also wanted to hear more about the economics of that. Was there contradiction? I think there was different points of view. I'm trying to think if there were specific elements. No, I think they were more on a spectrum of different kinds of views, but I wouldn't say that there were polar opposites. I didn't think we ever got to the point where it was, I don't know, Today programish, kind of like, we put you here to say this, and now we want you to say the opposite. it was much more nuanced than that. So they did hear a range of opinion and were able to draw their own conclusion from that. So I particularly when I think of the farmers that were there, they were talking about some similar things, but in slightly different ways and coming from slightly different perspectives. And not always saying that there were the same set of solutions, but there were these tensions between what we ask of farmers and the reality of their businesses and how they make a profit. So yeah.
Thank you. It's really interesting. And my question is more around like kind of next steps and thinking about the climate assembly when that came out, which was obviously like it was part of Parliament, so it had a bit more power in that respect, and then it's kind of been a bit ignored from government. I was wondering what's the plan next for it to be a bit more embedded in?
Yeah, so this is where I step back in and go, I put my National Trust hat on, and as part of the partnership is that we've got some advocacy activity that we're planning over the summer, spring into summer about this. What we are trying to do, we even through the process try to engage, but sometimes struggling to get parliamentarians to come and listen and observe the assembly. We've been particularly trying to target select committees and get them to consider taking or doing an evidence session with the citizens around that. We're in an interesting electoral moment of change, and so there's an opportunity to hear around manifestos and thinking about actually how might the citizens' voice be heard in the manifesto process. Actually quite a challenge at the moment because the dominant dialogue across the two major parties is very much an engineered solutions way to through the climate crisis, and even though there are some good things in terms of government policy and promises around nature, action's still a little bit slow on that. So there is a moment we want to work into. But yes, we now step in and we want this to be heard. There's something else that we've been doing in parallel as three organisations. There's a Save Our Wild Isles campaign, timed around a particular BBC programme, Wild Isles, people might have been watching. Some shows our moment there. But also we've created a series of business films that we're going to be taking out through the year. An overarching business film, but one on food and farming, one on the finance industry, and one on coast and marine. And those films will be very much targeted. So this is the interesting thing, which is the actors that we're targeting. There's political actors, but there's business, there's ourselves, there's organisations, but there's also things for citizens and community. So we want to over the next 6 months continue to get that conversation going. We want this to be also a platform for debate, so roundtables, events, anywhere we can take it where we think this is a good way to start a conversation. We're up for that.
I think we're going to have to stop there, but please do grab Alex or any of the other speakers afterwards. Our goal today was really just to bring a variety of perspectives on personalised ecology today, and I hope you agree we've achieved that. Yeah. And if we could just thank all the speakers again, please. There is lunch somewhere. I'm not sure. Over there. There's lunch over there. So please join us now. Thank you very much, everybody.